From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors these broadcasts, which are seen all over the United States in more than 100 communities. And it's an honor to have as our guest for this broadcast a dear man, a man I admire profoundly, Dr. Alan Keyes. Most of you watching this program know who Alan Keyes is. He's a man who has a distinguished academic background at Harvard. He served in the Reagan administration as an ambassador to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and I think he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Assistant Secretary. Sorry.
It's okay.
I didn't mean to demote you. And he's run for office. He has been probably the most articulate, persistent, persevering defender of the rights of the unborn, of any public figure in the United States of whom I'm aware. He writes brilliantly, he speaks brilliantly, and he has made himself an expert on the number one public policy issue of our time, immigration. Dr. Keyes, Alan, what should we think about immigration?
Well, I think the first thing we ought to be wondering is why we are in such a mess. Because I think that's actually a very critical question in that since the amnesty that was done during the Reagan years, and that's what it was, essentially.
And let me just interrupt to say that to the credit of Ed Meese, he wrote a brilliant piece in the New York Times in which he said that he had helped persuade Reagan to sign Simpson-Mazzoli, the amnesty bill, and it was wrong, but to Reagan's credit, he told the truth. He said it was amnesty.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They said it was amnesty. And it, of course, came with a promise that there was going to be strict enforcement. Nobody intended that we would periodically give amnesty and so destroy the integrity of our immigration laws or any attempt to regulate immigration. But that's what has happened. The amnesty came, and what followed has been decades of increasing and willful neglect of our southern borders, with the cooperation not only of our national elites and failed policies in terms of the policing of the border, the enforcement of immigration regulations, but you and I both know that at the state and local level there has been resistance and outright flouting of the law in such a way as to create what I often call an attractive nuisance, because you're actually attracting people into the country with the promise that they are going to get all kinds of benefits and medical services and education, whether or not they are here legally or illegally. And that has happened at the state and local level with no effort by the federal government to, in fact, turn to the states and say, look, you're undermining federal law, you must stop it or there will be consequences, which is what you would expect, given that this is an area where the federal government has a clear and legitimate and necessary constitutional responsibility. The end result has been an influx, as we know, of millions of illegal immigrants. And the numbers that you see now, I don't think, obviously, nobody really knows. Let's be frank about that. Because to try to keep track of this on a census basis when people are obviously not disposed to be telling you that they're here because of their illegal status, they really don't know. But I've seen numbers that range anywhere from 12 up to 30 million illegal immigrants who are in this country right now. And when you project that demographically, you already have a demographic revolution going on in terms of what happens as a consequence of the children of those illegal immigrants and so forth and so on. And we now have in front of us a bill that is being proposed by the very same elites that got us into this problem.
This is the Senate bill.
Right, the Senate bill. And when I say this, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that this is one of those issues which you can't pretend is a problem on a partisan basis. Yes, I think the Democrats have been in the forefront of championing the destruction of our immigration laws and the regime of laws that we need to regulate in a sane fashion the flow of people from abroad into the country. But we've also seen the connivance of the Republicans, and as we saw in the last debate, the Republican leadership in particular, and the leadership now of President Bush, standing out there to tell us what? That we need a comprehensive approach. Well, here's my main problem. What sense does it make to talk about a comprehensive approach, promising, yes, that we'll have immigration laws, and that will create a guest worker program and all of this? And I'm thinking to myself, but wait a minute. You can't have laws if you can't enforce the law. So if you're not in control of the border, no law you put on the books means anything, because people are going to come across regardless of any regulation you put on the books, unless you can stop them, direct them to the proper entry points, and thereby regulate their flow. And what does the president say to us? It was breathtaking. Did you see the speech he gave on this? I thought that what he said to the country was breathtaking. He looked us in the eye, and here, remember, is a president who's been in office. This is going into his 6th year, into finishing his 6th year. It's not as if he got there yesterday. And he looks the American people in the eye and says, we're not in control of our southern border. And he said it as if that was somebody else's responsibility. And I was floored. I said, the President of the United States announcing to us what? That on his watch, he hasn't been doing his job. Can somebody name for me a more obvious function of the presidency and of the executive branch and of the federal government than that of maintaining the security of our borders? I don't think there's anybody who would want to dispute that that is clearly a federal responsibility on the order, in fact, of defending the country, because that's one of the prerequisites of our security.
We should be defending our country even before we defend other countries.
Absolutely. We should be defending our country, first of all, and you can't even know what your country is if you don't know where its border is, right?
That's right.
So if we don't have a border, we don't even know what we're defending. Let's be clear about that. So he tells us that and this happened, Howard, in the wake of September 11th. And we watched after September 11th, people scrambling around. We've got to control our access points. We've got to have security at the airports. We've got to have every American going through checks and machines and this and that to make sure the bad guys aren't doing nasty stuff and getting into the country to kill us all. And meanwhile, the southern border's wide open. And literally, you can't even just drive a truck through. You can drive fleets of trucks through.
Right.
Filled with illegal immigrants, but then remember, filled with what else? We don't know. Filled with terrorists, filled with goods.
And under NAFTA, George Bush quietly is building a highway from Mexico to Canada through which countless thousands of trucks will pass. Supposedly, there will be electronic surveillance, but we have no idea what will be in those trucks.
So I look at this situation, and it seems to me that, leave aside all the other things politicians are trying to tell us right now, all the ways in which they want to play on the heartstrings of America, say that we're a nation. Everybody, I don't know too many people, especially those of us, and that includes most Americans, right? You trace it back a little further, some, a little less far others. But the truth of the matter is we're all people who came here from somewhere else, pretty much, except possibly the Native Americans. Even though even there, go back far enough, they supposedly came across the Bering Strait from somewhere else. But leave that aside. In the truest sense of the term, we know that this is a nation of people who have migrated here from elsewhere. But that's not actually relevant to what we're talking about, because the people who are at the moment in this big population of illegals aren't clearly people who came to make America their home. They are people who came to exploit an economic situation, and who, as we saw in the first weekend of those marches, what was the flag that those folks were holding as they marched through the streets?
Not American. You know, when my grandparents came here, they came to become Americans. Right. They didn't want to bring their Eastern European culture here. They were leaving that behind and embracing, even though they were of Jewish heritage, they were embracing the Christian culture of the United States of America.
Well, I think that we clearly have a qualitative difference now in terms of the ultimate both result and, I think, purpose of a lot of the folks who are making up this large population that is pressing us to somehow or another legitimize their status, even though they have acquired their residency in violation of our laws. But we saw their allegiance, all those Mexican flags. And I actually think that woke a lot of Americans up.
And in their cheering at sports events in Los Angeles, where they root against America.
Well, see, I think a lot of us have, over the course of the last 20 years or more, in our own communities, we have lived with this changing reality, and we know that there is a difference, because we have met with the fact that there is a resistance to the English language culture, for instance, and now an expectation that borders on entitlement, that folks have to deal with you in Spanish. You can't speak English.
And the resistance is dangerously reflected in Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which stipulates that ballots will be printed in languages other than English, In some places, there are 160 foreign language ballots. And Alan, I ask you, if people cannot understand English, how can they decide whose public policy positions make sense when they go to vote?
I think the language issue actually points us in the direction of what is, for me, a kind of deeper and underlying concern. Because if you think about the culture of our constitutional system of federalism and the principles of self-government, right? This was a unique development in the history of humankind, and it happened in the context, in terms of its fruition, of an English language philosophic culture.
That's right.
If you take us away from that culture, and obviously, I'm not English, I don't come from Great Britain, but I think that we can't neglect the reality that when I want to sit down and read the seminal thinkers of federalism and constitutional law, it is in English that I read them. So we're not just giving up a language. We are giving up the language in which the intellectual and moral culture of our liberty was developed.
Alan, that's such an important point you've made. My mother was kept back in the first grade because the only language she could speak was Yiddish. I thank God they made her learn English, because I would not have gotten into Harvard if I hadn't learned in those days, although now it would probably be a special qualification. And I know you got into Harvard partly because of your great mastery of the English language as a national debate champion. But we're going to have to take a break right here. We're going to talk about the amnesty for business, which has been going on. That's one of the most dangerous amnesties. Please stay with us, and we'll hear more from Dr. Alan Keyes. One of the top leaders in the Communist Chinese military declared that the United States is the main enemy of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China, which is longhand for what we call China. We have been building up our enemy, if that is a reciprocal term, by giving them most favored nation status and membership in the World Trade Organization. Last year alone, that gave them an $84 billion advantage in money which is fungible. And as a result of the extra money they have, they're not only taking jobs from the United States, they're increasing their military budget by 17% a year. It's time to stop sending technology and dollars to Communist China.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Face the Truth is a production of the Conservative Caucus and is seen twice monthly on the station you are watching. We will be interviewing the movers and shakers of the pro-life movement. We hope to educate and even inspire you about what is being done in our country to protect and to promote the sanctity of life. Please watch us.
Don't miss Face the Truth with Stephen Peruka and Conservative Roundtable with Howard Phillips right here on this station every week.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Help the Arbor Day Foundation plant more trees across the nation. Plant a tree today for all the world to share.
Go to arborday.org.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, and we're honored to have as our guest Dr. Alan Keyes. Alan, we talk about amnesty for illegal aliens, but there's also been amnesty for big businesses and some small businesses which have failed to comply with the law as they have hired illegal aliens. And the Senate bill doesn't do much to address that problem.
I don't think it does, because I think that the Senate bill reflects a continuation of the underlying political problem that got us into this, at least in part, in the first place. And that is the willingness to put the needs and demands of certain economic special interests above any consideration of the good of the country or the people as a whole. And I think that that's one of the things that right now is most disturbing to me about the immigration issue, because here we have in the Congress in particular, but also in the presidency, people who are supposed to have their first allegiance by oath to the Constitution of the United States. A Constitution based on what? The idea of government by the people. So they are to serve the whole people, the sovereign people of the United States, and that is their first allegiance. And yet, they have actually gone down a road that exposes this people to assault in terms of its very fundamental identity, that leaves its security a prey to the vagaries of a basically undefended border in a time of war, when we are faced with this challenge from terrorism that they say is so great and that in fact has proven to be great. And yet we don't seem to be putting that common good above the special interests that were represented by folks who were essentially what? They were interested in getting cheap labor.
Yep.
And in doing so, by the way, and here's something else Americans need to think about, undercutting the price of labor in America, and so lowering our standards.
George Bush says they're here to do the jobs Americans won't do, but Americans will do the jobs if they're paid properly.
Well, think about this. I saw not long ago, in the context of Hurricane Katrina, a story in the Washington Times about a lady who was an employment services person, and she had actually worked in the wake of Hurricane Katrina with some of the people who were refugees there in the area where they were trying to do some rebuilding in Alabama, and they had some folks who had come from Louisiana and were living in the area. She actually got a lot of these people hired to help do the construction work. They worked for about 2 weeks, most of them black folks who had come from New Orleans. And then she says in this piece, they got the word that the Mexican workers were coming in and that they didn't need these people anymore, and so they let them go. And I think that's a prime example. These are jobs Americans want to. No, these were jobs Americans had, and not only Americans, but Americans who were in a situation of dire need,
That's right.
which we all said we wanted to help them.
And the illegal aliens will work for a pittance compared to what the Americans will, and Americans have to support their families.
Well,
anything the illegals get paid is more than they were making in Mexico.
And we also know that part of the attraction of working with the illegal immigrants has been the fact that certain kinds of things, including health care and so forth, are actually put on the books of the American taxpayer, where you're going to the emergency room. And we know, studies come out about the great burden that now exists on our emergency medical services in this country, and yet underneath it all, we know for a fact, all of us, from the experience we have in our own communities, that burden is greatly fed by the fact that the emergency room is actually the first recourse of people who are here illegally, not the last.
And in many cases, we're talking about cash business, so that the employer need not pay taxes, which he would have to pay if Americans were in the employ. So there's a great deal of illegality that has been enhanced, not to mention the high crime rates, which are reflective of many of the illegal aliens. Now, I don't mean to cast aspersions on all of them. Some of them are wonderful people who are simply looking to better their situation. But the reality is, because of lax control of the border, criminal gangs have been coming in.
But also because you are dealing with a population of people, and I do not think this is a good idea in any case, who are kind of in this gray area, having to hide in one sense from the law, therefore prey to all kinds of exploitation and vulnerability because of their situation. I think this situation, among other things, is unfair to the decent people who came here looking for fulfillment of their hopes and instead have found what? What amounts to a kind of virtual economic enslavement in which they are at a disadvantage precisely because of the illegal nature of their situation. They're being severely exploited for these economic purposes. And then people try to put some big gloss of nobility on it. These politicians haven't been serving the noble aims of fulfilling dreams for poor people and so forth. They've actually been serving very crass economic motives that run contrary to the underlying interest of the American people and therefore, by the way, I would argue, of the American dream. Our goal should not be to shut the door in the face of hope. But in order to keep hope alive, we have to regulate the flow of immigration, make sure that people are coming to make this their home in the sense of the culture of liberty
and, to become
the maintenance
Americans.
of our institutions, to become Americans. And if we don't do that, then people aren't going to fulfill a dream here. They're going to be robbed of it.
And, of course, as the 14th Amendment is being interpreted, improperly in my view, if a baby is born on U.S. soil, that baby can legalize dozens of illegal relatives, simply by virtue of having been born
that
here.
You mentioned one of the things that is an essential element of the policy we need to follow. The first thing that we must do, however, and I think there are many Americans who in their common sense way agree on this, we must secure the border. No laws mean anything if, in point of fact, we cannot enforce the terms of those laws, making sure that people who come across only in a way that reflects what we have put on the books. The notion that you can pass laws before you have secured that border is absurd. Second, I don't think this is one of the things, given their track record, that we can take on a trust me from the very elites who have willfully neglected our interest in our security for decades.
And their arrogance is reflected in the McCain-Kennedy bill, which says before we build the fence, we have to consult with Vicente Fox.
Is this arrogance, or is this the utter and humiliating abandonment of American sovereignty? The very idea that we would have to ask permission before we do what's necessary to secure our borders ought to be both angering and, I think, deeply disturbing to most Americans. This is an absurd idea, and how it is compatible with their constitutional responsibilities, which are not, after all, to the government of Mexico or some foreign entities. They swear an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, which embodies the sovereignty of the American people, not of any other. And they have failed in this, and now they turn to us and say, we want a comprehensive approach which has guest workers and all these things which only mean anything if you have control of the border. But trust us on control which we have neglected willfully for several decades. It doesn't make sense.
One of the most disturbing elements of the debate in the Senate prior to their approval of this 750-page bill crafted by employees of Senator Ted Kennedy to a very great extent is the failure to support Nevada Senator John Ensign when he introduced language which would have stopped the Fox-Bush deal, whereby the Bush administration wants us to pay Social Security benefits to illegal aliens who have returned to Mexico. Ensign was defeated on a 51-49 vote. Incredible, with a Republican-controlled Senate.
I think that this discussion has reached a point where it's quite clear. The American people, at a level of common sense, are in one place on this. Our supposed representatives are in another. And by being in that other place, where they're willing to neglect our border security, where they're willing to assault the economic and cultural and identity interests of the American people, abandon what is the basis of our culture of liberty, in favor of what? In favor of what serves special interests and, I think, their own ambition, because a lot of them are hoping to ingratiate themselves with a whole flock of newly created voters so that they can transform the political culture of the country in such a way, to be quite frank, as to produce a result that will be less ornery. The American people are very ornery. You tell us that you want to put us under some globalist, internationalist government. A lot of people stand up and say, no, it doesn't sound like a good idea to us. We like our Constitution. If you can import a lot of new folks in, beholden to you, who aren't particularly strong in their allegiance to our constitutional system of self-government, then you might have an advantage if you are a scheming politician seeking to subvert the sovereignty of our people.
If the Senate bill were to pass, which it will not, experts have said that within 20 years our population would be 500 million, not the 300 million it is today, and that population would be heavily influenced by a couple of 100 million people who have no knowledge of American history, no ability to well use the English language, and who are in a position to utterly transform what was once the hope of the entire world, the great American Republic. We're going to have to take a break, Alan. When we come back in our final minutes, I'd like you to give us your thoughts on what governors and state legislatures, especially those in border states, can do to address this problem, given the failure of President Bush and the U.S. Senate, although we have to praise Jim Sensenbrenner for the leadership he's provided in the House. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Dr. Keyes.
Face the Truth is a production of the Conservative Caucus and is seen twice monthly on the station you are watching. We will be interviewing the movers and shakers of the pro-life movement. We hope to educate and even inspire you about what is being done in our country to protect and to promote the sanctity of life. Please watch us.
Don't miss Face the Truth with Stephen Peruka and Conservative Roundtable with Howard Phillips right here on this station every week.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Conservative Roundtable. We've been delighted to have as our guest Ambassador Alan Keyes. If you're interested in the kinds of issues we discuss on Conservative Roundtable, which is now being broadcast in more than 100 communities all over America, we hope you'll check out our website for the Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org. Fax us your questions and comments at 703-281-4108, or drop something in the mail at 450 Maple Avenue East, Vienna, Virginia, 22180. Just attention TCC. And information about contacting Dr. Keyes is on your screen. Alan, as on so many issues, your eloquence, your leadership, your perception has been unrivaled on this issue. What are your brief closing comments on what is to be done?
I guess I see a lot of the things I do as being of a piece, because I've tried hard to defend the moral and intellectual basis of the American Union, of the American system of constitutional self-government. And I think this whole issue of border security is about defending the national identity of this country, not because we resist the idea that all people will be attracted by this ideal, but because we want to preserve the reality of democratic self-government, of real freedom based on representation and the discipline and rule of Constitution and law. We want to preserve that as a hope for all humanity. And you can't do it if you get careless about it.
God gave us a unique gift in this American Republic. Right. And with that, a great duty to defend it and continue it.
That's right.
Alan, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
Glad to be with you.
We really appreciate it.